What's poppin', everybody? This is the Cartoon Kid, Ray Rollins, and we're on a channel where we talk cartoons and we do it weekly, baby. For today's review, we're talking about a nice modernly released episode of SpongeBob SquarePants from season 12 called One Trick Sponge. But before I get into breaking this episode down, I gotta give y'all that episode breakdown. Now, to be honest, this episode's fairly simple. We follow our favorite little spongy homie as he's trying to show everyone a new magic trick that he's just learned. Pretty simple premise of the episode. He goes around Bikini Bottom trying to show everyone his magic trick. No one wants to see it, but in the end, he ends up performing the trick for a bunch, I guess you could call them like little puppets or whatever. He creates his own little audience, and Patrick ends up observing the trick, and he enjoys it with his best friend at the end. So it's a pretty simple episode. Now, I gotta say, my first initial thought of this episode is, yo, why did they not do no type of callback to season 4 with the Hocus Pocus episode where he thought he turned Squidward into an ice cream cone? That was my first initial thought. And the reason why I bring that up is because you can argue that during that episode, SpongeBob had a bad experience with magic. You know, he thought he turned Squidward into an ice cream cone. He tries to find Mr. Magic. If I think that's his name. I'm going to reference that episode a lot during this episode. And I should have watched it before doing this review. I may get maybe one thing wrong here. I may misquote something from the episode. So please don't come at my head. Please. I'm a nice guy. But as I was saying, you think after that episode, SpongeBob had a real bad experience with magic. He finds out that Mr. Magic is a big fake-ass MFer. But you can also argue that the ending of the episode may have SpongeBob having a happy outlook on magic because he thinks he turned Squidward back into normal, and then he turns Patrick into a jar of mayonnaise. You can argue that SpongeBob's outlook on magic was redeemed in that episode. That's probably why he's still practicing it till this very day. Who knows? I'll be honest, I'm kind of disappointed that they don't have any callbacks to that episode, man. Because at the beginning of the episode, he is so happy that he learns a magic trick. And OG fans of the series, people who've been watching since day one, or probably even very early on in the series life cycle, it's just like, yo, we know SpongeBob has done magic before. This isn't the first trick he's learned. Hell, if you ask me, the trick that he learned in this episode isn't nowhere near as cool as turning Squidward into an ice cream cone. That's just my personal opinion. But the point I'm trying to make here is, it's kind of disappointing that there's no callbacks to that episode. Yeah, it probably wasn't the greatest, but, you know, OG SpongeBob fans are going to notice that, and that's kind of what had me a little bit disappointed. Now, I guess you could say I can get on to my favorite moments of this episode. This episode was primarily very cartoony, if I'm being honest with you. Like, I don't want to compare it necessarily to Courage the Cowardly Dog, one of the greatest cartoons of all time, at least in my opinion. I've seen a few episodes. I've seen quite a bit, actually. I've really enjoyed it. But the style, the comedic humor of this episode kind of has me thinking of Courage the Cowardly Dog. You see the trick stuff that SpongeBob always does, like when he's getting into Squidward's house, or how he's just magically popping up out of nowhere. SpongeBob does these weird cartoony things that kind of reminds me of Courage the Cowardly Dog. You see Courage doing his whole transformations and whatnot, pulling stuff out of his endless doggy pockets, you know, and it's very cartoony. And that's what this episode was. Like, especially the little scene at the beginning where you see SpongeBob get so happy. He's like, I did it. And you see his pineapple just whoop, 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 just bouncing all around, shape-shifting and whatnot. And listen, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's really not. Honestly, that adds to the comedic aspect of the episode. And for me, being a 23-year-old grown man, I love shit like that. I love me some cartoons. I love it seeing SpongeBob getting all cartoony. I think it's pretty cool. But you can also argue that, I wouldn't say it takes away from SpongeBob's character per se, but it makes him seem extra childish, you know? Me and my buddy Alex, when we were doing our classic SpongeBob reviews, we always reference back to SpongeBob's character and how it was back in season 1, 2, and 3. SpongeBob, yeah, he's an adult character per se. He has the mindset of an adult. He has the understandings of an adult, but he also has these childish characteristics as well. Although he's an adult, he acts like a child sometimes. But you can also say in this episode, he seems really childish. He doesn't even seem like an adult in this episode. That's another thing that you can say I'm somewhat disappointed in. But I'm not so disappointed. This was meant to be a cartoony episode. It's clearly what it was supposed to be. So I'm not 100% too mad at that per se. But they gave SpongeBob this extra cartoony personality, this extra childish personality for this episode because it complemented the theme well. So I'm not necessarily upset at that. Now, let me get into some of my moments. As I said, this episode was very comedic. You see SpongeBob coming around trying to show these people his magic trick, and nobody wants to see it. First person was Squidward, obviously. Squidward sees him coming, shuts his door, and he's like, oh no, come on, man. He tries to lock it. SpongeBob somehow, well, with cartoon logic actually, ends up getting inside Squidward's house. And Squidward's like, nah, man, I don't want to see your magic trick. And he ends up trying to get out of the house. And SpongeBob ends up appearing right by him. He's like, here, pick a card, any card. And Squidward just basically pulls out his own eyeballs. He's like, nope, I can't see it. Nope. And SpongeBob, of course, has to admit defeat and then just walk off. And Squidward ends up smacking into the door. That's the first, I gotta say, very funny moment of this episode. Second, that I just absolutely died over was when Mrs. Puff was working with a student and they were driving on the road. SpongeBob, of course, like, Mrs. Puff. He sees her all happy and shit. And she's like, yo, Roger, step on it. Roger ends up getting up out of that jam. SpongeBob pops up out of nowhere. He's like, here, I want to show you a magic trick. And Mrs. Puff basically is like, hold on, I got to show you a magic trick. She basically balloons herself up, man. She's a pufferfish. She can expand and whatnot. She had years of practice with SpongeBob and all his mad driving lessons. So she basically balloons herself up and floats into the sky to get away. SpongeBob, of course, somehow, once again, with cartoon logic, ends up latching himself onto her and once again tries to proceed to show her his magic trick. But he ends up getting released and ends up falling to the ground. And we see the whole scene with Sandy and her missing her head and whatnot. Sandy, of course, is a scientist, and she's doing all these crazy experiments. And she ends up putting her head in another dimension. And SpongeBob ends up getting spooked out of his mind because he sees a headless Sandy. Like, there's plenty of comedic moments in this episode. This episode was just pure comedy. I can go on all day with the comedic moments of the episode, and I'll end up listing every single one. But I gotta say, those had to be my favorite moments of the episode. So, my review for this episode, I gotta say, is it's not obviously the greatest SpongeBob episode of all time, okay? I think we all know that. But I'm gonna be 100% honest. It's not the worst SpongeBob episode of all time. It's an okay episode, in my opinion. And my rating, I'm gonna tell you straight off the bat, I'm gonna give it a nice 6.5 out of 10. Not the greatest, not the worst. It was okay. It's one of those episodes you see on TV, on Nickelodeon. You're like, oh snap, SpongeBob on. Oh, it's this episode? I'm not extremely excited to see it, but hey, SpongeBob's on. I'm in the mood to see my spongy homie on TV, so let's check it out. It's not going to be one of those memorable episodes of SpongeBob. However, because of the comedic aspect, the extra cartooniness of the episode, I kind of like it. I'm being 100% honest with you. Like I said, it's not my favorite, nowhere near one of my favorites, but it's not my least favorite either. It has that nice little neutral middle point for me that when if it comes on TV, I'm not going to change the channel just because it's not my favorite episode. I'm going to watch it. I'm be like, oh, cool, SpongeBob's on. Oh, it's this episode? All right. I'm going to check it out. I'm going to watch it because, like I said, it's an all right episode. It's not my least favorite, but it's not my most favorite. It's okay. Me personally, I'm a big sucker for comedy, and this episode obviously had a lot of that on display as I mentioned throughout this review. However, the things I didn't like about this episode, as I also mentioned, was the extra childishness of SpongeBob. However, you can also argue that it's there just to fit the theme. And I really didn't appreciate the fact that they had no type of callbacks to the Season 4 episode Hocus Pocus, where SpongeBob first learned magic and he used that magic to turn Squidward into an ice cream cone. No mention with his struggles with that and how he couldn't get Squidward back to normal. No mention of Mr. Magic and how that man was nothing but a con man. No mention of how he regained his faith, if you even want to call it that, when he thought he turned Squidward back into normal and he turned Patrick into a jar of mayonnaise. There was no mentions at all of that episode. And granted, maybe there wasn't supposed to be any callbacks to that episode, but you can't have SpongeBob go through that ordeal in Season 4 and then have another episode pertaining to magic where he learns a magic trick 8 seasons later and have no reference to that. That's the thing that really gets me. I'm not a big, plot heavy person. I'm just a guy who likes to sit back and watch cartoons and enjoy them. But if there's something like this that's so glaring of a plot point that logically doesn't make sense, I'm going to point it out, man. I'm really lenient on these reviews, but if I see something glaring like that, I have to point it out. And I love stories, I love books, I love cartoons. That's one thing I always say in every single review I do, damn near, is I appreciate a good story. Now, seeing a plot point like this or a character experience that has clearly been left out, I have to point it out. I don't like things like that. And seeing how they had no mention of that previous episode as SpongeBob's trying to show off his magic trick to everyone in Bikini Bottom, it's just like, man, you consider that to be a big ordeal for the character. Why would you have absolutely no mention of that? That's what really took away from this episode. If they kept the episode the way it was, honestly, and had that little callback to that episode, or they had that little mention of that episode, one, I thought it'd be pretty cool, because I've never seen a callback to other SpongeBob episodes being mentioned in a newly released episode. Like, you see no references, at least none that I can remember off the top of my head. You have seen none of that. I've seen none of that. So I'm like, oh, cool, they referenced that episode in this episode. Cool. And it works. But what are you going to do, man? I mean, not every episode's supposed to be perfect. And this clearly wasn't a perfect episode. However, that's something that had to be done in this episode. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who thinks that. Like I said, I'm not very critical on these reviews. I'm just going to tell you if I enjoyed the episode or not, because I'm a big fan of SpongeBob, man. I like to be lenient because I like to watch cartoons purely for enjoyment. However, I'm also going to tell you what I think. If I see something that's a glaring flaw or problem with the episode, I got to point it out. And this is an episode I really had to point it out. So that's what really took from the episode from me. That really bothered me. Besides that, I thought the episode was okay for what it was. It wasn't supposed to be anything super mind-bending or super plot-heavy. It was just supposed to be a comedic, fun, cartoony episode, which it was. It was okay. As I said a bunch of times during this review, it wasn't the best episode of SpongeBob, but in my opinion, it wasn't the worst episode of SpongeBob. The worst episode of SpongeBob has to be Breakin'. I'm sorry. The episode where he takes a break at the Krusty Krab for 5 minutes. That has to be the most terrible episode of SpongeBob in my opinion. And if I ever run across an episode worse than that, boy, I'm going to bash the ever-living hell out of that in one of these reviews. But with all that being said, man, I give this episode a 6.5 out of 10. I gotta say it one more time. Not the worst episode of SpongeBob, but definitely not the best. Very neutral. It's okay. I am the Cartoon Kid, Ray Rollins, and we're on a channel where we talk cartoons all the damn time, man. So if you like what I said during this review, please hit that like, hit that subscribe. Really appreciate it. You'll be helping me out big time. And as always, share your thoughts and opinions down in the comment box below. Tell me if you liked it. Tell me if you hate it. Tell me what you would rate this episode. Tell me if you're on my side. Tell me if you're not on my side. With the whole reference to Season 4's Hocus Pocus episode. And I'll be looking down in the comments, man. Also, tell me if you have any suggestions on future episodes you want me to review. But until then, I will see y'all when I see y'all. Peace out, everybody.